everybody. I'm Evie Roberts, and this is my podcast, Talking in the Dark. Welcome. The aim of this podcast is to raise awareness about blindness, visual impairment, and disability in general, in a happy and light-hearted way. For those of you that don't know, I am blind. I was born with a condition called bilateral anophthalmia. Try spelling that one. It basically means that when I was born, my eyes didn't develop properly, so I wear prosthetics instead. The goal of this podcast is to remove some of the stigma and stereotypes around disabilities, whilst also having fun at the same time. Each week, I will be interviewing people from all walks of life, including some with hidden or physical disabilities like mine, and getting to know a little bit more about them and the lives they lead. In this episode, I am very excited to tell you that I will be talking to disability advocate and founder and creator of Tilting the Lens, Sinead Burke. My name is Evie Roberts, and this is my podcast, Talking in the Dark. Welcome. Hi Sinead, how are you doing?
Hi Evie, gosh, what a treat this is. If I was to be in the dark with anyone, I am so glad it's with you. Thank you for having me.
Oh, I mean, it's such an honor to have you. You've done some really incredible things, so it's great to get to talk to you. How's your day going so far?
You know what? My day is all right. It's a little bit cold. I'm actually at home here in Ireland, so I am currently wearing a very large grey scarf that I have wrapped around me to try to keep me warm, but I am doing well. It was my birthday last week and I have embraced a new age and a new era, but I'm doing okay. How about you? How are you doing?
I'm doing okay. First of all, happy late birthday. But yeah, I'm doing okay. It's cold here too, actually. I got in the car this morning and it was like 6 degrees or something, and that was with the car heating on. And I was like, there is no need for it to be this cold.
No, winter is coming and fast approaching, if not already here, I think.
Honestly, yeah. And like, I love winter. I love Christmas. I just love everything about winter. The one thing I do not like is getting up at 7:30 in the morning for school and not wanting to get out of bed because I'm going to feel like a living ice block.
Yeah, it's a real mix. I mean, I long for the light of the summer and the kind of dark mornings and evenings. But I think, there's also something kind of beautiful and blissful about that too. So it depends on the person. We'll get there.
Yeah, definitely. So to begin with, I know that you, like me, have a disability. So could you tell me a bit about it?
Sure. In terms of self-identifying and self-describing, I'm a white cisgendered woman. I use the pronouns she, her. I identify as queer and physically disabled. I have dwarfism. I think more and more as I get older and become more aware of myself, I definitely think there is probably a self-assessment of neurodivergence or neurodiversity in myself. But yeah, my physical disability that I mentioned is that I have dwarfism. I often use the language to describe myself of being a little person. I think of myself as very fortunate because I grew up in a family where disability was familiar and common, in the sense that my dad also has dwarfism. So we have a multiple generational experience of disability. And I think that was an incredibly powerful tool and lever for me growing up, that in my household, at least, I was not other. I was the same as my dad. And that shared bond, shared understanding, shared lived experience, I think was really essential for carving out my personality, my confidence, and becoming an advocate from a very early age, because I had somebody, with such proximity show me the way.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I like to bring up the topic with a lot of my guests about role models. And usually when we talk about that, we talk about those role models that you see sort of on screen, or, I mean, on screen's the main one. But I mean, it must have been great, and you know, and to see those role models that have some sort of disability or are like you in some way, especially at an early age, I think is really inspiring. But it must have been amazing then to have someone so close to you, you know, your dad living in the same house with you with the same disability to sort of look up to and watch and go, well, if he can do this, then you know, clearly I can. I think I'm guessing that must have been sort of really helpful as you were growing up.
I think growing up in particular, it was a privilege that I wasn't even aware of. You know, it's that thing of the fact that it was my norm, right? And it wasn't until I got to know other little people in particular, and then also other disabled people, and realize how different their experience was to mine, because they didn't have that representation or visibility or access or proximity to somebody who had, you know, been through those paths before. But even the simplest of things, you know, there was obviously differences in my dad's and I's experience purely based on gender. But even if I think about how our house was designed when I lived at home with my parents, you know, there wasn't that many adaptations made to make the house accessible, but there were a few, like lowering the light switches, or a very simple one in the kitchen. The taps were at the front of our sink and not at the back. So even if you pulled a footstool over, you could reach the taps quite immediately, even if your limbs and arms were shorter like mine. And those things being in place from before I was born, I think just created, I suppose, the understanding, even among my siblings. I have 3 sisters and 1 brother. All of them are non-disabled. But that notion of adapting, of customizing your environments, of access being not just the norm, but something that was creative, something that brought us together, I think created a really great culture in our own family, that actually it wasn't something that was the responsibility of my dad and I to solve for, but it was something we all participated in. And I was probably far older than you, Evie, before I had, you know, the vocabulary to articulate what that meant to me and what it continues to mean to me.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think it's why you just don't really think about those privileges that you might have as a kid, but also on the other end of the spectrum. I think as a very young kid, you don't really think about the fact that you have a disability. You don't think about the fact that you're different to everyone else because you're a kid. You're not thinking about, oh, I have a disability. You're thinking about, like, if you're talking to 4 or 5-year-old, thinking about, oh, who am I going to play with at break? You know, you don't think about those sort of more real world things until you're a lot older, and then I think it sort of gradually hits you.
Yeah. And, you know, I think my parents really gave me such important tools from an early age. Like, if I think about, you know, even when I started school, my parents preempted the fact that, you know, I would probably get a lot of negative attention in the playground, that people would be curious, that children, you know, older and younger than me would be constantly asking questions. I think in their quest to, you know, understand or to satiate that curiosity. And instead of my parents kind of allowing me to figure those things out for myself in real time, they gave me language. So they would say to me, you know, if a child asks you, why are you so small? Maybe you could ask them, why are they so big? And a child will often say in response, well, I was born like this. And I would then say, well, so was I. And what it gave me was just the confidence to engage in those conversations. So I felt, even though everybody else knew that I was different, even from an early age, I felt really confident in who I was, because I was always taught that it wasn't something to be ashamed of. It wasn't something to be embarrassed about. It wasn't something that made me less of a person, but it was something that fundamentally made me who I was. And that has good days and that has challenging days, but everybody has good days and everybody has challenging days.
Yeah, absolutely, 100%. So, talking about growing up then in your sort of childhood, what was life like for you as a teenager? And were there any sort of reoccurring gaps with inclusivity that you faced?
I think it was probably when I was a teenager that I became really interested in design and really interested in fashion very specifically. And I think that was because I could see the gaps that existed from my experiences in comparison to those of my sisters. So, I remember being kind of no older than 13 or 14 and sitting with my dad and saying to him, how does fashion work for you? How do you figure these things out? And whether it was because my dad was male, whether it was because he had a lack of interest, or whether it was because of a lack of availability for him, he basically didn't have any answers to that question. He kind of wore what was available and didn't have any ambition to be more creative or to think about his personal style and ways. So I realized that that was an immediate gap, not only in his knowledge, but in the availability. And then it became really tangible and obvious as my sister started to get older. And my sister, who was 2 years or 4 years younger than me, just had such amazing opportunity to not just buy whatever they wanted to wear, but to immediately try it on, for it to fit, for it not to need alteration, and to just have so much choice, to not be confined to shopping in the children's department if they didn't want to. But that, I think, more than anything, it was recognition that they were thought of, that they were thought about, that they were valued as a customer, that there was a mannequin that looked like them, that there was advertising in the store that reflected their lived experience, that they could go to the counter in the store and transact independently, where every single one of those points in that journey was a symbol of my exclusion. And I think that was one of the first big kind of obstacles for myself that I recognized and that I saw and that I wanted to change. But I think the other one was society. You talked earlier about on-screen representation. That has, thankfully, particularly for people with dwarfism, changed a huge amount recently, whether that is looking to Game of Thrones and Peter Dinklage, whether that is looking to, even thinking about Children in Need and Lenny Rush, who's doing amazing things, or looking to Derry Girls, or looking to, the amazing actor Cara Maley or Francesca Mills. Growing up, that representation wasn't as frequent, or in many ways as positive. I think in reality, when I was a teenager, it was quite negative, and it was quite often that people with my disability would be the butt of the joke. And I think in many ways that shaped how other teenagers and other adults responded to me. It was very much my daily experience. And still today, it is the same in many ways, that people would point, stare, laugh, call me names. And I think I had to build a sense of resilience that I wish I didn't have to build, but also a sense of confidence and a network of people that I could trust and confide in when the outside world was more cruel than it had to be or than it should be.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely sounds like it. Yeah, I think that I talk about a lot with the podcast is that support network that you literally just mentioned there, about those people around you who can, can support you in some way. I think it's great to have people who are like you, who have, who have similar lived experiences to you, who will get it. But it doesn't always have to be that. It just has to be people who empathize with what you're going through, even if they don't fully understand, and know you well enough to be able to, help you up when you're down, or listen to you when you're upset, or sometimes give you advice if you need it. So I think that support network is really important.
Yeah, and to your point, it can kind of come from anywhere, right? It can, of course, be family, but not everybody is fortunate or lucky to have a family that is supportive, right? Some people grow up not with families, or with families that disagree with their choices. So sometimes it's friends, sometimes it's colleagues, sometimes it's a teacher, sometimes it's one person, sometimes it's 10. And I think just finding those people who, will challenge you, rightly so, when you're, not making the right decision, but who you can lean on to be honest with, to share experiences that are positive and negative, just so that you can build yourself back up again.
Yeah, I completely agree with you there. Now, you have done a lot of work with the fashion industry to work towards reframing fashion. So can you tell me a little bit about that?
About the issue as a whole, or the work or the journey? Which would you like to hear about?
I'm going to leave this up to you. Whatever angle you want to take
Okay.
is, yeah.
Well, I kind of started earlier by talking about having this conversation with my dad about being interested in fashion. And I felt such frustration at the fashion industry not acknowledging disabled people as customers. And I really started my advocacy thinking about disabled people as customers, that I had this big dream that I was going to change the fashion industry. And I kind of told my family and my parents. And at 13, they believed me. I think they kind of thought that I was a little bit bananas and sure, off you go try. I lived in this small village in Ireland and had this big ambition to change this global system. And my way in was through education. I would read everything that I could in the news every day about fashion and about the fashion industry, how it worked. And I would sit around the dining room table every evening and tell my parents, gosh, what do you think of Bottega Veneta inviting people who have just gone viral on TikTok and in the Olympics for the first time to the fashion front rows? And what does it mean that Alessandro Michele is debuting his first collection for Valentino this week? Now, that will be interesting to some people who listen to this podcast, but deeply uninteresting to most people who listen to this podcast. But that's where my interest came from, of like, how does it work? And in turn, how do we change it? So I started a fashion blog when I went to university, and that became the vehicle for so much of what happened next, from a TED Talk in New York to being introduced to who was then the editor-in-chief of British Vogue, Edward Enninful, to going to the Met Gala, to being on the cover of Vogue in 2019, through British Vogue's Forces for Change issue, which was guest edited by Meghan Markle, the Duchess for Sussex. And it was a wonderful and terrifying experience to be part of that issue. But one of the things that I really remember about being on set was that it wasn't very accessible. So I remember being lifted by another adult onto the hair and makeup chair. And I reflect on that moment quite a bit since, because I guess when I ask myself, when I think about it, was whose responsibility was it to create accessibility for me in that moment? Was it my responsibility to send an email in advance and say, hey, just checking that you have thought about the fact that I am a little person? And perhaps that responsibility was on me. But one of the nervousness and fears that I had at the time was that if I made that request, would I be considered to be fussy or a diva, or would it be easier to just engage with somebody with less access needs and to replace me? So I think I just sucked it up and said, I will see how it goes. But I remember leaving the set that day thinking about, gosh, if I ever had the opportunity to make sure that it wasn't just one little person or disabled person on the cover of Vogue, but that we could increase the representation of disabled people, and in turn make sure that the set was more accessible so that other people were not in that position. I kind of thought of that as a bit of a life mission for myself. And what I couldn't have predicted at the time, and that was in 2019, was that in 2023, my company, Tilting the Lens, would be the consulting partners and the consulting editors for the Reframing Fashion issue of British Vogue, which was an issue that we worked on for over 12 months with the British Vogue team. We had 5 disabled people on the cover, 5 different covers. We had 19 disabled people inside the issue. We ensured that all of the writers of the interviews and the articles were disabled. We also did training with all of the British Vogue team around digital accessibility and unconscious bias training. And we also did a review and an audit of every single studio in the London area to have an understanding of how accessible those spaces are, whether you were blind or low vision, neurodivergent, whether you were deaf or hard of hearing, a little person, a wheelchair user, really trying to think about accessibility in its broadest form. And we also made that issue available in Braille. And it was the first time ever that Vogue was made available in Braille, and it continues to be made available in Braille and in a digital Braille format and in an audio format, so as many people as possible can access that magazine. And I look back on that moment as a very tangible example of the work that Tilting the Lens has done, but also the progress, but being mindful that one issue alone is not success. And while we can have one issue that's focused on disability and accessibility, really every issue of every magazine should be focused on disability and accessibility. But taking a step back, which I don't often do, I think I'm very proud of the arc and the journey, because I think one of the things that sometimes happens when we think about change is that change only impacts the individual. It doesn't impact a community as a whole. It doesn't impact society as a whole. And I think, one of the other learning moments for me as part of that process was that we can have better representation of models in fashion. We can have more accessible and adaptive clothes in fashion. There is still a need for more of those things. But what we also need are disabled designers. So one of the things that the team and I have created is a partnership with Parsons School of Design in New York, which is a very prestigious fashion college, specifically for disabled designers. So we've just had 3 people started, a fully funded program. And what I'm really interested in seeing is, where do those designers go? Where do they work? What impact do they have? They don't have to be designing accessible clothes, but just thinking of creating greater representation of disabled people in industries that many of us felt were not for us.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, you've really done, so many incredible things within the fashion industry, and I'm kind of in awe of everything that you've been able to do. But I do want to, obviously having that dream as a 13-year-old that your parents kind of went, yeah, go do it, that dream that you had, that I think we all have things as a kid where we're like, when I grow up I want to be this, but not all the time do you actually then become that when you grow up. Not all the time do you actually pursue that dream. And so I think, would you consider yourself to be quite an ambitious person then, because you really kind of took that and ran with it and are now where you are today? But I'm guessing that wouldn't have happened without a good bit of resilience and ambition.
Yeah, I would say with great pride, I am a deeply ambitious person. I think ambition has been something historically that maybe people see negatively. And I think particularly as a woman, as a disabled woman, as a queer disabled woman, to have ambition, some people perceive it as almost crude, that you should be humble. But I don't think humility is the opposite of ambition. I think ambition is about having a vision and being dedicated to it and working towards it and striving for it. I think my parents from the very earliest ages encouraged me to have ambition. And, I now work with a team of all women, the majority of whom are disabled. And one of my big goals for them as individuals and as a collective is to be ambitious. And I think the piece around ambition is that often people are fearful of ambition because it can feel overwhelming. Because to your point, at 13, I said I want to change the fashion industry. I don't know if I can confidently say that I have changed the fashion industry. I think I've had an impact. But the joy of having ambition means that you have a goal or a North Star to reach towards. You may not get the whole way, but you get some of the way. And I think that is to be celebrated. And you can, move forward or change your ambition or change your goal. But I think we should really encourage people to be ambitious, because what is the worst that can happen? You don't make it, you fail. Well, fail better and try again, rather than saying to people that, your goals must be very small and sizable, because ambition is a negative thing. But I would say that I have always been a person who has existed with a notebook of ambitions and goals and things that I want to achieve.
Yeah, 100%. I completely agree with you there. And I think, yeah, ambition is a really great quality to have. Now, you briefly mentioned that you have a company called Tilting the Lens. So can you tell me a little bit about that company and what it is that you guys do?
Sure. We are a global consultancy which a focus on accessibility and strategic implementation, which are some big lofty words, but maybe I can kind of go back a bit and tell you how it came about. So I've talked a little bit today about my journey in fashion. And I think, speaking very personally, the pandemic was an event that really impacted me. So if we look to England, in the first wave of the pandemic, 6 out of 10 people who passed away from COVID-19 were disabled. And as a society, we came up with all of this strange language to make it easier to accept the loss of life. We would say things like, oh, but were they vulnerable? Did they have underlying conditions? And I became really challenged by this kind of mismatch of the pandemic being a mass disabling event. And yet so many of the things that disabled people have been calling for accessibility purposes, whether that was masking, remote working, assistive technologies, captions, were all suddenly being implemented because they were valuable to non-disabled people. And seeing that friction and that mismatch while at the same time being at home and acknowledging that, when I open the doors of my wardrobe, I have these really beautiful clothes that are made by some of the best designers in the world, but they're only made for me. They're not available to anyone else. And it made me ask the question of, did the fashion industry become more accessible because I was part of it, or did it become more accessible for me? And I think the reality is that it largely became more accessible for me. So I had this ambition, to move away from the notion that individual success was success, and instead to think about collective change, system change. So that idea of looking to the fashion industry, but also every industry, and thinking about, why is it that disabled people, and I mean by that all disabled people, cannot succeed here, cannot thrive here? Is it about the recruitment process? Is it about the design of the building? Is it about the policies and practices? Is it about the benefits trap? Is it about access to healthcare? Is there a skills gap? Is there a mentoring and a networking and a confidence gap? And what I had this big ambition to do was to create a team of people who have a lived experience or an expertise in disability and accessibility, and see what we could do together. And we're now a team of 7. We are based all across Europe. I'm just outside of Dublin in Ireland. I have a colleague in Belfast. I have 2 colleagues in London, one in Glasgow, one in Berlin, and one in Copenhagen. And over the past 4 years, we've been working on some amazing projects to think about accessibility in action. So whether that is in the workplace and creating buildings that think about not just the people who work there today, but the people who will work there in 5 years, 10 years. We have designed a playground by working with disabled parents to understand what do they need in terms of sight lines, in terms of having bells or wind chimes on the entrances and exits, so that if you're a blind parent, you know if and when your child is moving about safely. Thinking about even having seating and benches, that if you're a parent who's a wheelchair user, how do you navigate that space? Or if you're a parent who's autistic or neurodivergent, what does a quieter space look like for you to be able to support your child in that environment? Or I think about some of the work that we've done with banking, thinking about the pain points and challenges, particularly that deaf people have or people with learning disabilities have, to try to think about those solutions. So I think about our work as being a bit of an engine that we go into schools, companies, work with governments of all different sizes, and give them the tools that they need to implement better ways of working, better ways of designing products or services, to ensure that disabled people who are either internal or external can truly succeed.
Wow, I mean, I knew I knew how incredible of a company you guys were whilst doing research about you and about Tilting the Lens. I mean, you guys have just done incredible things, but actually hearing you talk about all the things that you've done and how the company came to be, and how sort of you realizing, and you thinking about sort of accessibility for as many people as possible led you to create this amazing, brilliant team dotted all around Europe. It's just, hearing you talk about that is amazing. And you, like you said, you're a real driving force. I think you have accomplished so much as a company, and I think you're real sort of innovators in accessibility. But actually, now I say that word, I want to that segues me nicely into my next question, which is, that word accessibility. Do you think that can sometimes be sort of misunderstood or misinterpreted?
Yeah, I mean, I think very deliberately we don't describe ourselves as a disability consultancy. And I think the reason for that is we often think about accessibility as a process or as an outcome. So I think often what we hear is that, when something is described as accessible, what it usually means is that either it's more affordable or it's available. It doesn't actually mean that it's designed with the intentions or with the understanding or with the requirements of disabled people. I think the other thing that we hear all the time is that something's fully accessible. But it's very difficult, and I think actually impossible, to make something fully accessible. So Evie, if I think about your access needs with your disability and my access needs with my disability, sometimes those things are the same, but oftentimes those things are different. So how can one thing be fully accessible to you and to me? So we often think about accessibility as something that has the kind of pillars or principles of flexibility, dignity, ease, comfort, and beauty. And beauty is important because when I talk about beauty, I don't just mean lipstick, but I mean how something looks, how something makes you feel. Because I think historically, when something was designed to be accessible, whether that is a white cane, whether that is an accessible bathroom, they're usually often very medical and very ugly. And that is because historically they've been designed by well-intentioned people, but not the disabled people themselves who are using them. And there's actually a really good example of this. I think one of the only mobility devices that has ever been considered from an aesthetic perspective is a pair of glasses. You look at how the fashion industry has adopted glasses and sunglasses and, introduced huge profit margins on them, but they are one of the few things that are actually designed to be beautiful. If we look at crutches, if we look at wheelchairs, if we look at hearing aids, so many of them still sit in the idea that it is more about function rather than about dignity and design. But in terms of accessibility, we really try to think about, in terms of our solutions that we design, from the most intersectional perspective possible. So what I mean by that is that intersectionality is this theory of research from Kimberly Crenshaw, who talks about the ways in which our identities overlap, but specifically how the world engages with us. I think even within disability, we can sometimes create a hierarchy. And what I mean by that is we create this prioritization that one person's needs are more important than the other, or that they're easy to solve for. So making sure explicitly that we are leaving nobody behind, and that we are talking to people of color, we are talking to Black disabled people, trans disabled people with learning and intellectual disabilities. We're talking to queer and gay disabled people, because I think one of the most brilliant things about the disabled community is that it's so dynamic and diverse and so broad. So I think our definition of accessibility is trying to make sure that we are creating environments and products and spaces where disabled people have to do as little work as possible to be accommodated and to assimilate. So we're trying to meet disabled people where they are so that they can be themselves and thrive without having to do all of the work in advance just to exist.
Yeah, I mean, I really love that. But yeah, I completely agree with you that, especially about what you've just said about, making sure that disabled people aren't having to do 10 times the work just to get along with what they need. If I think about one of my previous podcasts I've done, and we're talking quite a while ago here, but I did it with a lovely man called Gary O'Donoghue, and Gary is he's an incredible journalist. He works in America now. He's like the head of sort of political journalism at the BBC in America. And I can't really remember how we got to this point in the chat, but he said about sort of sometimes it feels like when you're disabled, you're sort of paddling furiously under the water, just trying to keep up with everyone else. And I think that I really have absolutely adored that quote since he said it, because I think sometimes disabled people have to do 10 times the work just to get along with all the things that they need that sometimes able-bodied people wouldn't have to do. And I think especially with accessibility, disabled people shouldn't have to call ahead when they travel because they're not sure that there will be someone there to help them out, or they shouldn't have to really deeply consider pretty much everything just to make sure that it's going to be accessible for them. Those things should be thought about so they don't have to do much work for it, just as much as things like that would be thought about for people who are able-bodied. So because we're all human. We're just
acknowledging the cost that has. I was just talking to somebody earlier today who was telling me about a colleague who is a wheelchair user, and they couldn't get housing locally. So they now live almost 2 hours away and are commuting. But when they commute, they can't rely that the local train station will have a ramp to the platform off the train. So they always have to travel with somebody. And then when they get off the train, they have to get a taxi to the workplace. And then at the workplace, they have to ring ahead so that somebody is ready to open the door. And I made the point that, gosh, that person must be exhausted by just the time they get in the door. And then they have to do 8 hours of work and they have to overperform in order to convince everybody else that to be disabled is to not be a bad thing, but you have to be exceptional rather than ordinary. And then they have to do it all over again just to get home. And I don't think we are at a place in the world where we have calculated the cost of that.
Yeah, 100%, absolutely. And I think it's that thing of sometimes with accessibility as well, where if a group of people have made sort of one adjustment to how they do things to make it accessible, they think, right, great, we've, that's that done now. It's completely accessible.
Well, I did this piece of research. I'll say I didn't do it. The team did it. Last year with people who were blind and low vision across 3 countries, Germany, Italy, and the United States. And one of the people from Germany gave us this great quote, which I think about all the time, that accessibility is like a sandcastle. You have to keep nurturing it. You have to keep rebuilding it. Otherwise, the wind or the sea will wash it away. And it goes back to your point that sometimes we think it's this one-stop shop, that once I've done it, I'm done, rather than thinking about actually it's a daily practice that we all need to get better at and be mindful of whether or not we benefit from it.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree with you there. So moving on to sort of representation then, do you think that sort of looking at who's not in the room representation wise, when it comes to sort of planning design and decision making, for industries and environments, etc., would you say that that is the way forward?
Yeah, I think thinking about the pipeline of talent, and I use talent really broadly, right? We can think about talent as teachers, we can think about talent as architects, but I think having greater representation of people in rooms where decisions are made will, in the long term and in the short term, just support better innovations and will, I hope, ensure that people are not excluded. And I think it will also encourage us to be a bit more ambitious. So if we think about the built environment, for example, lots of what happens in the world in which we live around accessibility is because of legislation and codes. And I think there is a belief system that once we meet the minimum requirements, we're done. But the reality is those legislations and those codes were only ever designed to be a starting point. They were never designed to be the cap because they still don't fulfill the needs for as many people as possible. So how do we build a kind of mindset in with people, whether it's designers or architects or engineers or, quantity surveyors, that actually these things are minimum? And while they may or may not cost more money, how do we be a bit more ambitious to see what's possible? I do hope, and there is new rules coming down the line from the European Union called the European Accessibility Act, which I think is going to have a really significant impact on digital services, particularly as we think about people who use screen readers or assistive technology. I do think we're going to see a real shift because companies and governments will have to make those changes. And I hope what that does is create more of an appetite to think about what's possible rather than just doing it because we have to.
Yeah, 100%. I think, that doing it because we have to. That should not in any way be the mindset surrounding accessibility. But unfortunately, I think sometimes it is. And it goes back to your point about, okay, we've done the minimum requirement now, we've ticked that box. Great, that's good. That's cool, that's accessible. But it's like, if you were, I don't know where this analogy has come from, but I'm going to roll with it. But like, if you were building a tower out of building blocks, you wouldn't put one building block down on a table and go, okay, cool, that's good. You wouldn't do that. You would keep building it as high as you can go. And it's the same with accessibility. You wouldn't just put the minimum down and go, okay, great. You want to keep building on that. You want to keep making things as inclusive, as accessible as possible.
Absolutely. And you know, I think the thing that we need to encourage people to think about is that for such a long time, I think accessibility has been seen, particularly by designers or planners, as something that makes their work less interesting, less creative. It's often seen as something that they have to compromise with or on. And I think where we need to move to is seeing it as an opportunity, for creativity, for innovation. And I hope that we're getting closer to that.
I hope so too. But yeah, I get what you mean, actually. And I think, you know, accessibility, if I think about certain industries, like I'm going to use like sort of like, yeah, I'm going to use audio description and subtitles as an example here. So if we think about like the movie industry as a whole, if you think about the amount of movies that I know from my perspective do not have audio description, movies and TV shows that do not have audio description. If you put audio description on all movies and TV shows, think about how many more people are going to watch them. Think about how much money how much more money that company will then make because of they've got bigger viewing figures. It is an opportunity. It helps people out as well. And sometimes actually making things accessible can be just as beneficial for like able-bodied people as it is for disabled people, like audiobooks. How many people listen to audiobooks? Audiobooks are great. But that, you know, but that not only
audio description, you know, we use a certain scene from Frozen, the film, that is audio described in all of our trainings. Because actually, I believe that Frozen audio described is better than Frozen non-audio described because it's actually funnier, right? And we're seeing this even with Bridgerton. There has been so much conversation on TikTok over the past number of months about how Bridgerton with audio description actually has more value for both a sighted and non-sighted audience. And again, is innovation. And I do think I've been in rooms over the past couple of weeks with technology experts who are talking about the importance of AI in captioning and in audio description. Now, I do think there's a quality piece that will have to match so that for people who are blind and low vision, particularly, that there's the same experience with a human audio describer as there is with an AI audio describer. But what I hope happens is that, to your point exactly, Evie, we get more content made more accessibly, but you know, there's big barriers and hurdles that we have to face in the film industry. But I do think that the streamers like Disney Plus, Amazon Prime, and Netflix and Apple TV are showing historic broadcasters the value of having those tools built in. Because even if we look at Gen Z are by and large watching content with captions on it, whether or not they need it, because it creates just a better multi-sensory experience.
I completely agree with you there. And actually, going back to your point that you made about that scene from Frozen, it's actually made better with the audio description. I can remember one situation with my mom, and I can't remember what show it was. It might have been Stranger Things, which is a show I'm obsessed with, and I love the audio description. The audio description is brilliant. And I was talking to my mom about this one particular scene, and I was like, oh, I love this bit where, I can't remember what it was, but I love this bit where this happened. And she went, what? And I went, yeah, you know the one I'm talking about. And she went, I didn't see that. And I went, oh, the audio description described it to me. And so sometimes it does make it better.
Yeah. And it fills those gaps, right?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. It's a really brilliant tool. Now, I know that you have written a children's book called Break the Mould. So could you tell me a little bit about that?
Sure. I wrote Break the Mould originally for children who are 8 years and older, but I deliberately tried to write it in ways in which it could be read to a child who is younger, but also that it would still not talk down to an older audience. If you are 12 or if you are 40, that you would hopefully still get something from it. So it's very much about how to take up space in the world. It is rooted in my lived experience, but what I tried to do within the book is take that lived experience and project it broadly so that people could see themselves or take lessons from it. And what I really wanted was to encourage people to realize the importance of being who they are, and the fact that the world is different because we exist in it right now in this moment as we are, and to try to encourage people to advocate for the things that they believe in, big or small, and to feel a sense of community in who they are and in the space that they take up in the world. But it has brought about some amazing conversations in schools, in classrooms, in universities, and my hope was that it would help one person to feel a little bit more confident in their own skin.
Wow, I mean, that sounds absolutely brilliant. So what would you say then has been your proudest moment so far?
Gosh, I think I can speak to kind of a couple of them. I'm really proud of the book in a way that it will outlive me. It will always exist. It will be in a library on a back dusty shelf, or available in an audiobook, or as a braille copy somewhere in the world, to pour over and to find something that resonates with them. I think I'm really proud of a mannequin that I created many years ago so that it can exist in exhibition spaces and we can have greater representation, particularly in museums and in cultural spaces. But I think if anything, I am really proud of the people that I work with. I think the main goal of creating something like Tilting the Lens, and I say this often to the team, is that we're planting trees. And what I mean by that is we are doing work that we may never see the impact of, because trees take a very long time to grow. They often, grow very tall and large, and it'll be decades before you see them flower and flourish. And I work with amazing people who are working towards a shared common goal. And I think the thing that I'm really proud of at Tilting the Lens is that this isn't just about any one person, but about a group of amazing women who are working together to try to create long-term change. And I am proud that the work of Tilting the Lens will outlive me. It will continue to exist, hopefully, and that I hope the people who work at Tilting the Lens will be shaped by the culture that we have at the company, that their skills will grow, and that they will feel a huge sense of pride in the things that they achieve. So I'm very proud of this thing that I and we have built together, from our spare bedrooms or the corners of our sitting rooms as we work remotely, to try to think about the big problems and how we solve them.
Yeah, and I mean, it really is an absolutely incredible company. So looking forward then, do you have any sort of goals or aspirations for the future that you'd like to achieve?
Oh, all sorts. I mean, I have a list, Evie. I won't bore you with the list, but if I think about, I turned 34 last week, and if I think about the next chapter of my life, it's very much thinking about how I can continue to use the resources that I and we have at Tilting the Lens to think about, greater investment in disabled people. So, for example, we have talked about potentially setting up a production company so that there could be podcasts or documentaries that we could help resource and equip. Or if I think about creating an imprint, right, so that we can support the publishing of disabled writers, disabled authors. If I think about creating an investment fund so that we can invest in disabled entrepreneurs and make sure that whatever resources we have can move forward. Or I think about creating a foundation. And those are, very structural things that I think are ways in which we could move into new spaces to meaningfully support disabled people. But if I think to the future, what I personally want, and here's some learnings on my end. So those are big things as like CEO of Tilting the Lens. But as me, Sinead, I have some new rules for myself. I am going to, in the future, start being kinder to myself. I think the challenge of being ambitious is that one is very hard on themselves, because you're always thinking about the next goal, the next thing, the next moment. And I think being kinder to myself and being a bit more generous with myself in my own mind is something that I'm going to be working on and will continue to work on. And I think part of that is also being patient. Change takes a really long time. And I am both a patient and a deeply impatient person because I want it all to happen today and tomorrow. So I'm going to be doing that. And then, yeah, I think the last thing is making time for joy. I think those of us who are working in this space to create change, it can be really overwhelming. It can cause you to lose sleep. It can make you, be so focused that you're at your desk or doing things that take up all of your time. And you said this earlier, Evie, life is short. We have to just, take a step back and make sure that we are creating space for friends, family, joy.
Yeah, I really couldn't agree with you more there. I think there's some really brilliant aspirations. I mean, yeah, they're all amazing aspirations, but I really love that last one there, and those last couple actually, just being kind to yourself and making time for joy and being patient. Because like you say, change takes a long time, and change cannot come about, I don't think, if you are not in the right mindset to make it happen. And for you to be in that mindset, you've got to be, sort of, obviously we all have good days and bad days, but I think you've got to be in a place where you're happy with what's going on around you. You've got good people around you. You've got nice memories to look back on, and you're excited about what's going to happen in the future, and that you're taking care of yourself as well.
Absolutely. And that, whether it's access to a therapist, whether it's making sure you're going to your doctor's appointment, it's about looking after yourself completely.
Yeah, 100%. Well, Sinead, I mean, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I actually don't think there are enough compliments in the world to describe you, but you're just the most wonderful, incredible person. You've had such an impact on so many different things, whether it be the fashion industry, whether it be with your book, whether it be with Tilting the Lens and the incredible work that you guys all do. You just have you've just had such an amazing impact. And not only that, but you have such a lovely personality. And I can tell that you're a really resilient, ambitious person. So I really can't thank you enough for giving up some of your time to talk to me. It really, really does mean the world.
This has been such a treat, and I would do it at any time of the day, week, or year. Call on me anytime, Evie. And, when you eventually get round to thinking about employment and a job, we'd be honored if you call us.
Oh, thank you so much. That's really kind of you, and that really does mean a lot. Well, thank you again for coming on the podcast. It's been such a pleasure to meet you, and thank you to my audience for listening, and I will see you all next time.